So he was a dear friend, and I'll always be grateful that he kept me until the end. I think the challenge of occasions like today is actually wanting to recollect the historical legacy of a person while also recognising the personal. So I'll just begin by marking a few points. He was born on the 2nd of September 1948 and he died on the 12th of September this year, just over 11 weeks ago. He'd reached 76 years of age, just. And his last year was a struggle for him, both physically and mentally. He'd reached that point where he was ready to go. And it was not so much as defeat, but an acknowledgement that he'd reached the end. Gore Vidal once stated that life flows by and you flow with it or you don't. Move on and move out. Bill was an admirer of Vidal and supported that same sentiment. And that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone here, as he'd marked so much of his life with a keen sense of when to call time. Time on a multitude of positions and roles throughout the years, a pattern of activity and strategy that was based on both a sense of managing best outcomes and keeping momentum. He had a great mind, one that had been nurtured as a child, a young man who actually had just been educated around the corner at Sydney Grammar. And then he commenced work as a clerk in the Parliament in 1968. He had a family background of a level of wealth and social standard that afforded him entry to a number of places and institutions where he learned about political networks and the power of connections. While he seemingly rejected the trappings of that life, he kept the learnings of those worlds and how they operate, and how to master influence across their layers. As for his biological family, he loved them, and he was sentimental in many ways about their history and lives. At his death, he still had some of their personal belongings. Each thing was a reminder of a childhood and upbringing that he valued. A theme emerging of his life was the contradictions. While he didn't want the family traditions and their career paths for his own life, he always included the individuals of his family in his life. I think that was illustrated by the role of carer that he took on for each of his grandparents and parents as they needed until their deaths, and the lifelong relationships he maintained with his brother, sister-in-law, his 2 nieces and a cousin. So after 8 years, he left the New South Wales Parliament, where he'd risen through the ranks and, of course, succeeded at everything he undertook. He was still in his 20s, but he'd exhausted himself. And that was another theme, I think, that emerged in his life. He gave anything he focused on his all. He was a force of nature. He would literally work and work and work at something until it was done. And then he'd stop and sleep for days. Then he'd want to move on completely. His way of moving from a point where he'd become bored and restless and felt he'd delivered what he'd set out to achieve. The Qantas trolley dolly moment was next, and again, only the top level satisfied. Trained in first-class air service with the silver service skills for international travel around the world. He loved meeting people and enjoying the lifestyle that those work trips, often to the US, offered. He became familiar with New York especially, and it was to remain his favourite destination for many years. At home, he started getting involved as a volunteer in Mardi Gras, and close friends he made in those years here and overseas were the gay family that he loved and kept close. He left Qantas finally to return to Maroubra near the beach to live with his grandmother and cared for her for over several years. Needing shift work at that time, he was doing market research, working as a switchboard operator, driving a taxi, while being a surfer, a beach walker, hitting the venues, visiting friends at Patches. 1984 was the year he met his partner, love of his life, the man he would marry, Warren Peel. Warren and Bill were together from that point for the next 40 years until 11 weeks ago. Bill cherished that relationship, fought hard to protect and maintain it. Warren refers to Bill simply as being his rock. They lived a life of complete opposites in terms of interest in the community work and sector involvement, but were so compatible in eccentricities and humour and life values. They had lived over the many years with dogs and lizards and advocated to be appointed guardians 16 years ago for a disabled man living in community care. They shared a symbiotic life of richness, unique design, attraction and mutual love. He was also mentor to so many of us, wise and supportive, giving sage and smart counsel. He could be ruthless and withering. If someone crossed his objectives or were a threat to those he gave loyalty, there was a side that was indicative of his pursuit for an end game. He definitely believed in the notion of greater goods outweighing any of our possible bad deeds. The man was a chess player most of his life and competitive to win in most things he attempted. He drove people to help in those causes and would keep you accountable till the deed was delivered. But he saw allegiances as relevant to the cause or the importance of an outcome, which is why he could move between so many circles and belong to all or belong to none, as that time demanded. His intimate gay circle or died before him, and he'd wrestled with severe depression several times across the decades. Humanity and kindness were his motivators, and his external and personal visions were simply the same. Steeped in an acute sense of rights and social justice, pulled together in threads through trauma and grief to protect those he loved and to try and spare more injustices and deaths from communities which had experienced too much and which he personally was profoundly impacted. I always think of him as a man for all seasons. He lived a life of simple comforts. He stayed true to himself and his principles. He enjoyed saying he was a privileged, penniless person, and he liked keeping his life simple. But he also had extreme likes and dislikes. Christmas was one of the latter, made him furious. Music, the former. He was a great fan of the character Arnie Mame, played by Rosalind Russell, who advocated total sexual freedom, world travel, and the feverish excitement of the creative career. Both Mame and Bill believed that life must be art. One of the highlights of his life was when he was working with the Australian ambassador to the UN for the 2001 UN Special Session on HIV. And he was invited to visit the Australian ambassador's official residence located on Beekman Place, the same place where Aunt Mame had lived. And he said the ambassador's staircase was identical to the one that Aunt Mame had used. He could charm the room and he had a laugh and wit which was wicked and mischievous. He enjoyed people but also his own privacy and quietness, often to listen to every federal parliamentary question time he could. He had curiosity and a love of learning and intellectual stimulation, which is why he so much enjoyed working with each new wave of younger men and women across the sector. But he also said it was because they didn't come with the history and baggage that I do. They bring fresh energy. Bill led a life of achievements, beginning with the Mardi Gras chair, then CEO, the Sydney Star Observer Community Chair, the inaugural CEO ACON. In years following, he strategised with ACT UP leaders, contributed to the founding of NIPWAC, the forerunner to NAPWA. He supported the growth of PLWHA New South Wales. He was ordained the Pope by the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence in 1990. And in 1992, he was awarded a member of the Order of Australia. In that 2 years alone, he'd also just completed his first term as President of AFAO. He was still to go on to work 30 more years across Australian and international AIDS responses, including a significant period of treatments advocacy. His work beyond Australia had begun from the work undertaken here, developing models for new trials and treatment access with collaborators. And it expanded through to the UN, UNAIDS, WHO, and within South Africa and the Southeast Asian region. The past decades of our national and international strategies and implementation plans for responses to HIV, they bear his fingerprints, his framing and his language. That legacy from that era is simply stunning and I think displays the longevity and resilience of an extraordinary person. He said once, "I've led an interesting and fairly high-profile life. All of this has not been intentional. It's simply been an accident as I've fallen from one thing to another. The most that I ever hoped for is that I could make just a tiny contribution, he said, just a sliver of a difference, to make a tiny contribution that would make things better. Well, we've all been enriched by having him in our circles, organisations, forums and part of our work. A sort of brother, godfather, grandpa. He succeeded on every level and in immense ways, and his life will be remembered as giving so much more than a sliver. To quote Lemony Snicket, I now find myself often muttering, "The world is very quiet without you around."
Thanks, Jo, and indeed more than a slither. Now I'd like to invite Murray McLaughlin up. Murray was anointed by Bill to succeed him as president of the then Sydney Gay Mardi Gras following the 1986 Sleaze Ball. Murray was subsequently president of Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras from 1986 to 88, and then Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras as it became in 88 and 89. Murray was in the chair of Sydney Star Observer in 1991 when it was still community owned, establishing a pattern that Bill was later to follow of former Mardi Gras presidents becoming Star Observer chairs. I escaped that. In retirement, Murray is active in health and cancer consumer advocacy at the board and committee level. Murray.
Thank you, Mark. There's still time for you to become the chair of the Star Observer, should it ever return to community ownership. Wishful thinking, perhaps. Look, as somebody who's very rarely stood in front of a crowd of people with microphones in front of me and been completely unfamiliar with public speaking, I've taken great heart with, thanks Hila, that's a David Wilkins technique there. Where's the pink gel? I've taken great heart in that the professional speakers, who you're also going to hear from, have also prepared what they're going to say, and in fact are probably going to read it like I am. In starting, I really need to say, I guess that Bill and I hadn't seen much of each other in the years following our involvement in the then Sydney Gay Mardi Gras in the mid to late 1980s. We'd crossed paths when Bill was chair of the board of the Sydney Star Observer, as Mark has mentioned, through our mutual membership of the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras Hall of Fame, to which Bill and I were appointed, along with the late Ron Austin in 1995, and at Hall of Fame dinners that were held in the late 1990s. We did, however, arrange to do lunch while chatting at Bruce Pollock's 70th birthday at the new old Heffron Hall in 2018. Because I lived in Wyong and still live in Wyong at that stage, and Bill and Warren were in Woy Woy, we thought, well, let's meet somewhere around there. And the chat was largely along the lines, well, what have you been doing for the last however many 20 years? Bill said that he'd come to enjoy working with what he described as feisty women. One of those he mentioned was Jo Watson, who at that stage I was starting to learn about as I was taking some early steps into the world of consumer health, and particularly cancer consumer health. However, the person I probably more immediately identified in Bill's context as a feisty woman was Lavinia Crooks. And in thinking about her more recently, I've been reminded that one of the things that linked Bill, Lavinia, and a whole range of other people, many here today, was the role that dance parties played during our lives in the years of the onslaught of HIV/AIDS during the mid to late 1980s. I clearly remember feeling taken aback, to say the least, when I was moving around on a Royal Hall of Industries dance floor, seeing Bill and Peter Tully standing on its edge, both wearing sunglasses. I remember thinking in my naivety, and I probably hadn't started taking drugs at that stage, how on earth can they see anything wearing sunglasses? It was only later, and perhaps less naively, I realised that seeing wasn't the point. apart from the fact of being seen to be very New York cool. And Bill and Peter, I think, personified that, and the great friendship they had much to contribute to Mardi Gras. In mentioning Peter, I'm aware that there's a view that Bill got involved with Mardi Gras so that Peter would have a continuing source of income through his employment as the artistic director. And that money, initially at least, had come from a grant from the Australia Council. The first such, I think, community grant to a queer organisation. It was $6,000 for us to employ an artistic director. Whatever the truth of that, and I'm sure if Larry Galbraith were here, he would correct me, Bill knew, along with the late Kevin Golding, that if the sense of community, of commemoration and of celebration that Mardi Gras provided in the 1980s and into the 1990s, and hopefully still today, if that were to continue, then there was a need to implement systems and processes that put the organisation on a firm organisational and financial basis that would help ensure Mardi Gras' continued survival and growth. Graham Carberry, in his A History of the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras, indicated that, and I'm glad I've put this quote in a larger font. Following the 1985 AGM, the newly elected committee revised its financial and administrative structures, and that was very largely Bill and Kevin's work. The massive increase in running the 1985 Mardi Gras party, that's an increase in costs, and I think largely from the shift in the licensing arrangements for the party. So that massive increase had sounded a warning bell about the future viability of the Mardi Gras itself. And this is my comment, surprising perhaps that 40 years later not much has changed, if you've seen today's Sydney Star Observer lead article. Under the leadership of Chairman, they were different times, under the leadership of Chairman Bill Whittaker, a management plan was implemented to improve efficiency, tighten financial control and reduce costs. I'm not sure how well necessarily those financial controls lasted. I do recall having to step in when we discovered that the float that the workshop was using was being used to finance the rent of one of the workshop artists. More interesting times perhaps in the history of Mardi Gras. The year would later be recalled as the beginning of the professionalisation, that's in those things, of Mardi Gras, with both the positive and negative connotations of that word. Bill used to say that he learnt much of what he knew about organisational politics from observing Neville Wran when Bill was a clerk in the New South Wales Parliament. I suspect, however, that Bill had more than a passing acquaintance with Machiavelli's The Prince, where Machiavelli wrote, "There is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things." Bill never entered into something that he wasn't sure of the outcome. And if that involved being at times fairly hard-nosed, and Joe has pointed to that, about whether the appropriate people were doing things, then that's what had to be changed. And I will never forget the meeting that was held of the Mardi Gras Committee, I think upstairs at the Old Exchange Hotel, when Bill ruthlessly but clinically decapitated Brian McGann in a literal. Sorry, so that's what happens when you depart from your notes. You see, one of those in that sense. I don't think Brian saw what was coming, but Bill could do that, and for very good reasons. Bill did that. In late 1986, and just before, or was it after that year's sleazeball, Bill summoned Bruce Pollock, who was the Mardi Gras secretary at that stage, and me on a Sunday afternoon to the house in Zamia Street, Redfern, where he and Warren were then living. It was to tell us that he would be resigning as president of Mardi Gras, a title he had introduced, no more chairman, but president, and that he would be moving to the AIDS Council of New South Wales, and that I would be the next Mardi Gras president. He clearly realised that what I can call the Whittaker effect was needed if it, ACON that is, like Mardi Gras before it, were to survive and grow to meet the increasingly complex needs of those living with HIV/AIDS. I'd never imagined myself as the president of Mardi Gras, let alone the president of anything really, but I'm enormously grateful to Bill that he opened opportunities that I didn't see, but ways in which, with Bill's mentorship, I like to say, I could in some ways contribute to Sydney's queer communities. What Bill did at and for Sydney Gay Mardi Gras, I'm sure, formed the basis of how he managed and developed all of the other organisations that he shaped over the next several decades. But of course, no former Mardi Gras president or CEO or whatever his position was of ACON has ever stunned people in the way that Billie Jean did as a safe sex slut, an ACON safe sex slut at the 1988 Sleaze Ball in the late 1988. Thank you, Terry Batterham, for getting that right. That image, if you've ever seen it, and I couldn't find it online yesterday, but it must be around. It's deservedly one of the iconic images of Mardi Gras that Bill played a large part in ensuring is now hurtling towards its 50th year. Thank you.
Thanks, Murray. I'd now like to introduce Bill Whittaker AO. Bill was Chief of Staff to Dr Neil Blewett, the Commonwealth Health Minister from the election of the Hawke ALP government in March 1983, just as HIV and AIDS pandemic began its course in Australia. Bill Whittaker and Bill Whittaker had met earlier when Bill Whittaker worked in Sydney with the Rand Government Attorney General, and Bill Whittaker was very active in the campaign to legalise homosexual sex. Their friendship dates from those days and campaigns. Bill.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to everyone who's put this on today. It's great a way to commemorate Bill. Our dear friend and colleague Neil Blewett sends his apologies. He regrets he's unable to be here to join with you in celebrating the life of Bill Whittaker. And he's asked me to extend his deepest condolences to Warren, to Bill's family and friends, as do I. From the first time that Neil and Bill met in 1983, Neil was very impressed with Bill's incisive advice, calm and considered strategic assessments about what might be done to respond to the looming crisis. Neil especially recalls Bill's insistence that the voices and interests of those most affected by what became HIV and AIDS should not only be heard, but that their representatives should be on every committee that mattered and in every room where policy was formed. Bill and his colleagues made the persuasive, irrefutable case that prevention or mitigation of the spread of HIV could only be achieved and sustained with the full support of affected communities. Existing public health structures were inadequate, responsibilities were fragmented between the 9 Australian governments. Therefore, Bill said, and his colleagues said, new structures and organisations were required to bring together all those who were closest to the problem. People with haemophilia, sex workers, injecting drug users, gay and bisexual men, First Nations peoples. Bill and his colleagues said that these new structures should not be within but outside the control of governments. They should draw their legitimacy rather from the communities they represented and served, and had to be funded generously so as to be able to speak and act freely. They should work in equal partnership with governments, researchers, clinicians and the public to ensure access to care and treatment and clinical trials and to deliver prevention services of all kinds. Faced with these unprecedented circumstances and this powerful advocacy communicated by Bill and many of the people here in this room, Neil and his ministerial colleagues readily agree that these new organisations should be created and generously funded. The ministers trusted the communities to spend the funds wisely and well, which, as history shows, they did. Since 1983, many generations of Commonwealth, state and territorial ministers and MPs from all parties and none benefited from Bill's impeccable advocacy and advice about HIV and AIDS. Neil is sure that his political colleagues over 4 decades would join him in offering his heartfelt thanks to Bill for the remarkable and enduring contribution he made to the protection and betterment of Australian public health. Not for the first time, I agree with Neil Blewett. From the first days of AIDS, Bill was a guiding star in a remarkable constellation of people who built the Australian response. But he was one of those rare people who had both the vision and the imagination and the inspiration to see what needed to be done, but also, on the other hand, the dedication, application and administrative skills to deliver on the promises and undertaking that he and the communities were making to the Australian governments and to the Australian people. In astonishingly short order, in 1983, Bill and his wonderful colleagues, again many of you who are here today, including, it has to be said, the redoubtable Phil Carswell, who died earlier this year, developed the framework of new community organisations that became the beating heart of the Australian response. This mobilisation in 1983 and 4 brought support and relief to those with HIV and AIDS and vital information about prevention to at-risk communities to encourage behaviour change. As a result, in the first 2 decades of AIDS, many tens of thousands of people, tens of thousands of additional HIV infections and deaths from AIDS were avoided. Bill's great and enduring legacy to Australia, to New South Wales and to Sydney is to have played a pivotal role in creating these organisations and thereby to have helped in averting these many thousands of needless infections and deaths. This effort's been sustained over 4 decades by all of those who followed him and his colleagues who have led, staffed and volunteered at ACON, their sister equivalents around Australia, and the many community groups that came together in those years and have lasted for so long. But Bill's contribution was not confined to Australia or New South Wales or Sydney. Internationally, Bill attended just about every international AIDS conference from the first ones in 1985, 84. And the same qualities of persistence, politeness, intellectual rigour that so impressed the policymakers here commended Bill to those responsible for the far harder task, enormous task, of building an effective global HIV AIDS response. UNAIDS was created in 1996 and the Global Fund in 2001, and we're honoured to have Lady Ros Marata, the chair of the Global Fund, and Di Stewart from the Global Fund here today, great friends of Bill's. Just as in Australia, the new international HIV architecture, however, required an overarching statement of the principles, the goals, the objectives that would govern and direct these organisations and the international response. Therefore, in 2001, 2006 and 2011, the General Assembly adopted successive political declarations on HIV and AIDS, each one more advanced and better than the ones that preceded it. Bill, of course, was prevailed upon to assist in the onerous work of drafting 2 of these declarations in 2001 and 2011. Let me just say, don't lose your thing. Our good friend Jonathan Stambolis, known to many of you here, who once served on ACON's board and who was then at the UN New York, worked with Bill on the negotiations for the 2011 political declaration. Thanks to its record, Australia had been appointed co-convener of the 2011 drafting committee. Jonathan remembers that on arriving in New York in 2010, Bill dived headfirst into the monumental work ahead, stationed as he was, as always seems to be the case, in a modest, windowless office at Australia's mission to the UN. There, Jonathan says, Bill tirelessly crafted draft after draft of the negotiating text with seemingly unlimited energy and matchless efficiency, and as Jonathan said, not unlike an early pre-modern version of ChatGPT. Jonathan marvelled at Bill's encyclopedic knowledge of HIV policy and his stamina over the long, hard months of negotiations that ensued. The final political declaration adopted in June 2011 was a blockbuster. It shattered long-standing barriers to progress and achieved political commitments from member states that once had seemed unobtainable. For the first time in the then 30-year history of the pandemic, the member states ended their decades of silence about sex with men, sex workers and injecting drug users, and agreed to prioritise these populations in national HIV strategies. Jonathan states categorically that achieving this consensus in 2011 would not have been possible without the contribution made by Bill's meticulous attention to detail in the texts and hard work. Jonathan honours not just Bill's remarkable legacy, but also a kind, generous and witty friend to him who lived a life powered by love and service to others. I agree with Jonathan. My friendship with Bill predates the onset of HIV and AIDS. I first met him in about 1981-82 when, as Mark said, I was working with the New South Wales Attorney-General. Bill was part of a remarkable group pressing the Rann Labor government to legalise homosexuality. This pressure had been building since the Rann government was elected in 1976 and increased tremendously after the 1978 police riot and the beginnings of Mardi Gras. But the forces of reaction were strong and the government was dragging its feet. Bill was everywhere all the time in support of this push to legalise homosexuality in New South Wales. From his time in the New South Wales Parliament and the Library, he'd developed a wide range of contacts with members of Parliament from all parties and all shades of opinion. And he used these contacts and this knowledge to press hard on the issue of legalising homosexuality as the 70s went on. I recall him as a powerful and compelling advocate. His qualities were on full display when he and his coadjutors lobbied the Attorney-General and the various factions of the New South Wales ALP. It was the greatest good fortune that the demonstrators, protesters and advocates in the cause of New South Wales homosexual law reform were ready, willing, available and able to apply themselves to dealing with the AIDS crisis when that came along. I marvel at the political skills and dexterity of Bill Whittaker, Lex Watson, Don Baxter, Graham Head, and all those who in 1983 were dealing with public alarm and malice about the gay plague, but who nevertheless in 1984 somehow managed finally to persuade Neville Rann, the New South Wales government, the Parliament and the people to recognise and support the rights of gay men to live and love legally. Bill's contribution to the decriminalisation of homosexuality in New South Wales should be remembered and celebrated. For the 45 years I was privileged to know Bill, he was the best and closest of friends, a confidant and a true comrade. He was wise and patient. He forgave me my many foibles and passing enthusiasms. I trusted him implicitly. I loved him, I will miss him, and I honour his memory. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Now I'd like to introduce Julie Bates. Julie Bates AO is a long-term activist for the human and legal rights of vulnerable and marginalised people, particularly sex workers, people who use drugs illicitly and people living with HIV and AIDS. As a consequence, she had first-hand experience of the detrimental impacts of social isolation and legislative harms on these vulnerable communities, and the community action and political responses necessary to effect change. Coming from very different backgrounds and demographics, but understanding the basic fundamentals of how civil society ought to behave to bring about a more enlightened and equal society, Julie and Bill's worlds collided at the outset of the HIV pandemic. Together as members of ANCARD, they collaborated on social justice issues, often in the most challenging times and environments. Julie.
Thank you, Mark. Did you actually see my notes? I just keep looking at this wonderful photo of Bill. What a man! What a face! I always thought I would see him one more time again, as many of you probably did. But it's an incredible honour, you know, to have been asked to come here today to share a few of my memories, of Bill, the life of Bill Whittaker, friend, fellow activist, advocate, visionary, community leader, and so much more. I'd like to just quickly start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present and to First Nations people here with us today. Trying to work out when I first met Bill, but I reckon it was back in about 1984, 85, and he'd just been appointed the inaugural CEO of ACON. Thank you very much. I'm a bit short for the Bill. Hotel's time. Yeah. And I was the spokesperson for the Australian Prostitutes Collective. You know, it was a heartbreaking time, but an exceptional one. A time of forging alliances and friendships, collaboration, mutual respect and support across affected communities. But not just that, but amongst clinicians and researchers and politicians and bureaucrats. This had never happened before. Bill was smart and knowledgeable, and he could blend in with the suits in Canberra, you know, but he could still hold sway with his community and throw on a frock like the best of them. And I remember, if only Peter Carmel, who was our chair of Anchor at the time, had seen Bill in his wonderful safe sex slut outfit for Mardi Gras that year, Murray, I think 1989, 90, I'm not really sure which. But you know, Bill knew how civil society, and we've heard his upbringing, his pedigree, and how he came to be who he was, but you know, how civil society ought to behave, and he dedicated himself to championing a human rights evidence-based response where people, policy and politics come together to form a more enlightened and civil society, shaping policy and indeed saving lives. He understood that community engagement was the key, and he took on leadership roles that helped consolidate this ideal. We've talked about the formation of community organisations. My focus today, though, is going to be on lesser-known aspects of Bill's life. Nothing too naughty, you know, but I'm going to be a kind of conduit to people who wanted to share some of their memories and pay their respects. When the Australian Prostitutes Collective lost our funding, a very sad day for me and my colleagues, Bill advocated for me with his board to take on a sex worker project rather than let the community's response be lost. But he did this rather reluctantly because he would say to me, Julie, communities are best served by being represented by their own kind, by peers. Wise words, but these were very different times and very few choices did we have. In the late 80s, fear and loathing and misinformation was raging across Australia, and some of you may remember the headlines of the day. AIDS hall charged, you know, front page of the Sydney Morning Herald. And there was an increasing focus on sex workers. The blame game was in full swing, and the media was having a field day. Into this milieu stepped one young, vulnerable woman. Her name was Charlene Spiteri. Following her interview on 60 Minutes, where she spoke of a client's reluctance to use condoms, She became the HIV whipping girl for much of the HIV epidemic at the time. Clearly, Charlene was not the only one navigating a life at the pointy end of the virus, trying to negotiate safe sex with her partners. But all roads led to her. Putting out another call, Bill stepped up again, helping me strategise. He would come to my office in Darlinghurst, Alex Wodak's methadone clinic. I had a little office out the back. So, you know, he would step up every day and we would strategise on responses to the media and others. And then me extracting Charlene from the clutches of 60 Minutes and needing transport, and much more than that, I needed support and I really needed Bill to stand beside me. I called on him again. Unprecedented times. And some of our civil society advances appeared to be seriously under threat. We got to the car in the Acon basement. Charlene tried to get into the driver's side of the car and this incredulous look on Bill's face going, "Well, let her drive, Julie." I went, "No, actually, Bill, she doesn't drive." And I don't think that Bill actually drove the Acon car much himself either. It didn't take long, though, for the powers that be to track us down. And despite all of our best efforts, Charlene lived under a kind of house arrest for the rest of her life. But it was due to these efforts and that of Bill and others, and many of you in the room today, you know, that few others suffered the same fate. I said I was going to be a conduit, so I'll wrap up with a few of my friends and colleagues and many of you today. Ross Duffin, who can't be here today due to illness, and he sends his apologies. Waiting in a queue to get into the midnight shift, next to a person wearing a loud, bold T-shirt that said, "A dingo took my baby." The T-shirt by David McDermott, the wearer, Peter Tully. The start of an endearing friendship that led to Bill becoming president of Mardi Gras. Then, as Ross says, turning up to a meeting of the tennis club on his appointment as CEO, which I thought was entirely appropriate, says Ross, given his nickname, Billie Jean. And we're not talking about Marilyn here, after a very, very bossy champion tennis player. Bill could certainly be bossy, and was certainly a champion of working with governments. More information on the tennis club you'll have to look up for yourself, and it can be found in that book, that wonderful Acon book, Fighting for Our Lives. But as Ross says, suffice to say, once Bill arrived, there was no more tennis club. I can share with you later if you want to know a bit more about the tennis club. But Rigmor Berg, an early Acon board member, I have huge admiration and affection for Bill, a great manager of both issues and people. Thick piles of reading material would arrive and I'd feel so guilty that I haven't got to it all. I'd turn up at the meeting and he'd give us all a bit of a manageable problem to solve, but really, he'd already solved all the big problems, you know, before we'd even arrived. I never saw him make a bad decision. He was a truly wonderful man. Victoria Midwit and Pitt, director of the documentary Rampant, How a City Stopped a Plague. Bill emboldened for me why we made this documentary. Behind the thoughtful intelligence, a fierce power, a burning anger. Behind the anger, so much sorrow. Behind the sorrow, phenomenal compassion. All shot through and bound together with a wicked sense of humour, which some of you have shared, and we know he had. One of the most beautiful and formidable souls I've ever had the privilege to meet. From Greece, Effie, a HIV-positive woman, an advocate for people who use drugs and people living with HIV. I feel I owe a lot to Bill, a great and special man who left his mark. Please convey my love and respect to Warren and his family and to his colleagues and friends. To Deborah Giblett, who's in the room tonight, sister of the late Terry Giblett. Bill believed people living with HIV and AIDS should have a voice. They should speak for themselves. And so he went about creating this new position that would do just that. My brother Terry, a very proud and out HIV positive man, very, very proudly accepted the position of HIV support officer. I will wrap up now with words from Bill himself. All of us in the room have been part of this journey too. Activism is the price of keeping ahead of diseases such as HIV and keeping ourselves and our community healthy and dynamic. It's a good reason to remain involved in activism and to encourage others to join in. Vale, dear Bill, thank you for your very brave and considered counsel to me and to others. Your priceless contributions. Thanks.
Thanks, Julie, and thank you for adding in some other voices to the messages this afternoon. Now we're moving on to Graham Head, AO. Graham's the Secretary of the New South Wales Department of Customer Service. He was ACON's first education officer and second employee all the way back in 1985. He's a 78er and knew Bill for 40 years. Graham.
Thanks, Mark, and nice to be with you here with people who were all part of this journey. It is a privilege to be asked to be a part of a ceremony that memorialises Bill Whittaker. He was a singular figure in many aspects of the life of the gay and lesbian community in Sydney, and his work and his life were profoundly important for our community. I think Bill Botel mentioned the death earlier this year of Phil Carswell, and both Phil, who I met when I was 19, I think, in the mid to late 70s, and Bill were very influential, not just in the response to HIV, but more broadly in the great opening up of everything that started to happen with gay liberation in Australia in the 70s. In thinking about what to say without resorting to a string of anecdotes about Bill, because when you're sort of in sixth position, I thought there's a reasonable chance that any anecdote that I tell will possibly have been covered once or twice. It struck me that I might make a couple of other observations, and one was that there are some very significant things that we take somewhat for granted now. People have talked today about the success of the Australian response to HIV, but that was not inevitable. With 40 years down the track, it almost looks as though it was all planned to be this way all along, but it was not inevitable. The fact that ACON is a large, vibrant, evolved community health organisation was not inevitable. When I arrived in December 1985, and there was no CEO then, John Pearce was the part-time, I think, administrator for ACON, and he said, we were above what was then the TAB on Oxford Street, on Crown Street. It's now a Taekwondo studio. And he said, don't come up the rest of the stairs. There's no chair and no typewriter. Here's the petty cash. Go and get your chair and typewriter and then come and do some work. So it was not inevitable that ACON became the organisation it did. A number of people have remarked on Bill's organisational skills and his capacity for strategy, his vision, his tenaciousness, his work ethic. It's really the contribution of Bill in particular, not exclusively, but his contribution at a critical point in time, I think, that laid the foundations for ACON becoming the professional, disciplined, high-performing organisation it became. And also, I think, as Bill Botel outlined, his ability to work with the structures of government, but also his deep commitment to the involvement of community in HIV were also critical foundations for that. So what we think of as looking like things that always would have come to pass actually were quite precarious things, and a very important part of them coming to pass, I think, goes to Bill, the vision, the imagination, combined with the work ethic and really, I think, an extraordinary capacity to charm. I remember a couple of times coming into situations where I was absolutely determined that something was going to happen a particular way and not really understanding exactly what had happened when I left the room, and I was committed to a completely different way of doing things. But a lot of that is about Bill's sort of unique traits. I am ad-libbing a bit because I don't want to retell things that people have told, so I'm ignoring Murray's advice to stick to my notes. I don't remember when I first met Bill. It may have been connected to one of the law reform activities. I was not a central player in that like Gary Cox and other people, but was, as somebody who'd been involved in the first Mardi Gras and involved in gay rights issues generally, I used to help out with things. So it may well be there, or at the big public meeting in 1984 that was really the event that ACON was birthed from. Certainly what I do know is that by 1985, when I started work at ACON, having previously been a nurse, I was in regular contact with Bill, partly through the variety of HIV AIDS events that were happening in the community, but also I was sharing a flat with Jim Jenkins, who can't be here today, who I think was the first full-time staff member employed at Mardi Gras. And I had taken over Don Baxter's room in that apartment. We were all part of we all circulated from household to household. So I was on warm terms with Bill and saw him quite frequently. I was 27 at the time, and I think probably fairly accurately described as full of myself. And Bill would listen to my very strident rants on a variety of things patiently and would respond with warmth and care. He would pose a lot of questions and almost always had the effect of making me pause and think through what I was saying and doing. I came to understand that he thought I was pretty good raw material but needed to polish up a bit. And we didn't work together much directly because I'd been seconded to go and work on the National AIDS campaign when he came in as CEO. But I continued to work on HIV/AIDS issues in the New South Wales Health Department after that period. So we had a lot to do with each other. And he was always very patient with me. But I came to understand after a few years that this was partly in the service of my own development and partly to avoid him needing to perform some kind of decapitation in my general direction. So he was not, and I loved this about him, he was not going to let the idiosyncrasies of individuals, even people he liked and thought well of, get in the way of the job that needed to be done. And that is a really critical gift that he gave to all of us, that he understood how important the job was, and while he tolerated all of our foibles, there was a point where he would go, nope, this needs to happen, you're being a pain in the ass, you need to be sidelined. I was never on the receiving end of that, but I have great gratitude to Bill that he was able to do that, because I think he never was self-indulgent about what we were all involved in, and it's no small thing to be able to continue to nurture friendships, but understand that there's a task to be done and then to draw yourself up to full height to do it. So I think, he was an important mentor for me as a young person, and I make these points not because of his interaction with me, but I think generally, if he saw enough positives in somebody, he naturally lent in on things that would help them be better at what they did, and that this would be better in turn for the collective effort we were all involved in. Well, I think Bill had the measure of his own contribution. He knew that the fight we were in would not be won unless there was an army of people who could all do heavy lifting. He did his own part, more than his own part, and mentored, I think, many of us to play our parts better. He had great interpersonal skills and organisational skills. I think the former were a natural part of Bill in his early life. He was always a model of courtesy, and I think the way he treated people was very disarming in difficult discussions. He was very hard to react negatively to because of his warmth and consideration of other people, and it was disarming for people. I don't know whether his organisational skills were innate or whether they came about from working in Parliament in those formative years in his career, but he knew how to get things done at a time when both ACON and Mardi Gras would not have become the successful organisations they became without somebody who knew how to get things done at the helm. Jim Jenkins, who I mentioned before, isn't able to be here today. He, and I think I said this before, was the first full-time staff member at Mardi Gras, and we lived together, shared a flat together in the mid-80s. And he tells me that when he first worked with Bill, he had no clue about how to deal with anything to do with the media, but understood that both in terms of Mardi Gras' success and ACON's success, he would need to learn all about how this worked. And Jim's recollection is that Bill was a very, very quick study on all of this and curious. Jim had journalistic experience, and Bill would interrogate him on the fine arts of things, and then once he was comfortable, he was rattling off press releases and news stories as though he'd been trained all of his life to do it. Jim says that under Bill, the Mardi Gras committee went from being very disorganised, he used a more colourful turn of phrase than that, to a well-oiled machine, and all achieved with a minimum of fuss and without, notwithstanding some of the brutality of some of those times that Murray's mentioned, without some of the drama that might otherwise have attended those events. On mentorship, Jim put it this way, quote, "Though he and I were of a similar age, to receive Bill's approval was like receiving longed-for praise from a stern but loving father. It was all the sweeter for the fear of disappointing him." And that corresponds to my own experience too. He radiated something that made you want to do your best work connected to things that he was involved in. So that description sums up my own experience of Bill, a man of courage, courtesy, intellect, modesty, shrewdness and tenacity, and with that the capacity for the right kind of ruthlessness in certain circumstances. He was a builder of things, not as monuments to himself, but as foundations for our community going forward. And in all the years I knew him, without exception, it was always a joyful thing to run into him and spend time with him. And I'm very sad that he's gone.
Thanks, Graham. Now I'd like to introduce Philip Keane. Philip is a Senior Research Fellow at the Kirby Institute. Philip met Bill in 1987 at the time of a rally about access to AZT outside New South Wales Parliament House. He started working at ACON in 1989 when Bill was CEO, and Philip was working at AFAO when Bill started his second period as AFAO President in 2000. In 2012, while working at NAPWA, he worked with Bill and Joe Watson on NAPWA's advocacy for early HIV treatment and for the licensing of rapid HIV tests. Since 2013, Philip's worked at the Kirby and HIV research studies in New South Wales. In this role, he worked closely with Bill on the implementation of 3 consecutive New South Wales HIV strategies. Philip.
Where are you, Graham? Everything you just said with some of the things I wanted to say about Bill. But look, yeah, I guess my experience of Bill was meeting him before working with him, and you talked about how people knew each other socially. I lived with Gary Cox and Simon Donohoe, and we used to kind of all go to people's parties, like at houses, and people would have like barbecues in those days. But so I got to know Bill, and I thought he was charming, you know, he was lovely. It was only later that I got to see another side of him, and he could be so formidable. But yeah, when I started working at ACON, I remember Lavinia was the president and Bill was the CEO. And they were living together in a house called Ivy Cottage in Surrey Hills. And they would have us over for parties on Friday evenings, having been working hard all week. Someone talked about dance parties. Mark, you talked about dance parties. I mean, did they create Hand in Hand? I think the Hand in Hand parties were some of the best parties that ACON used to put on. I think so. But look, I think the time that I really remember closely about Bill is from 2011 onwards. So after the 2011 political declaration that he helped write, you know, he came back and he was so energised about what had just been released, the results of a trial, the HP 10052 trial. It was about treatment as prevention. And, you know, he was someone who cared deeply about HIV prevention generally. He was a fierce advocate for people living with HIV, but he was concerned with HIV prevention. And he created this slideshow that he would show to anyone who would, you know, had to sit through it. But he was single-handedly creating a vision of how we could take the science and really work with it and change how we did HIV prevention in this city, this country. And I think one thing he wrote me into, I remember, was the 2012, the Health Minister's Declaration. There was a conference in Melbourne, and because, you know, they were all coming to, wasn't the Ward AIDS conference? Okay. So he wanted them all to sign a declaration that they were committed to, you know, pursuing the science. But really that became the framework for what we do now in HIV in this country. And so, you know, his legacy lives on. But I remember from 2013, I started just when the first rapid HIV test had been licensed in Australia, and he got Tanya Plibersek to turn up and launch it at Albion Street Centre. I had just been employed at the Kirby to run a trial of rapid testing, which at that time was in 4 sexual health clinics, and I think Rebecca Guy had got some funding to expand it to 12, but Bill, who at that time had become the chair of the Ministerial Advisory Committee, he would be on the phone to me, the coordinator of this study, saying, "What about this other sexual health clinic?" And, you know, before I knew it, we were in 22 clinics. I didn't dare tell him there were over 30 in New South Wales. But then, you know, then I think myself, Andrew Grulich, Tony, we had years with him as the Ministerial Advisory Chair, with Kerry Chant once every 3 months, you know, meeting and going over the HIV data every year, and they were such a formidable pair. But yeah, I think, you know, it was his incredible breadth of vision. He could work at an international level, but he would also be, there calling someone who was working at a project level and saying, "You've got to do this," and there was no way you could say no to him. Joe, you talked about furniture. So one thing I have of Bill's is it's the best piece of furniture I have. It's in my lounge room. It's this big buffet. So I often see that and think about him. I think it was his mother's, and but yeah, look, he's with us, and he always will. Thanks.
Thanks, Philip. And you introduced the next speaker, but she's not here to talk, so I'm going to read from a message from Kerry Chant, the New South Wales Chief Health Officer. And as Philip mentioned, Bill worked with Kerry on the New South Wales HIV Implementation Task Force. Kerry says, "I've had the privilege of working with many brilliant people, but for me, Bill Whittaker stands out above all others. His intellect was unquestionable and his passion and drive unwavering. He shared his wisdom freely and was open to the frank and robust contest of ideas and perspectives. On a personal note, I experienced his compassion and care as we talked about family and navigating life. We all owe a lot to Bill, and each of us has a responsibility to honour his legacy as we collectively strive to achieve the virtual elimination of HIV." And also a note from Chris Puplik, former federal senator for New South Wales. Chris sent the following, amongst other things, Chris has sent a following message. "I had the honour of working alongside Bill Whittaker, a truly great Australian, as we faced an unprecedented challenge to both our national health system, our community and the world at large. I worked alongside Bill initially as a senator serving on the Parliamentary Liaison Committee on AIDS, then as chair of the Australian National Committee on AIDS, Hepatitis C and related diseases, and also as chair of the AIDS Trust of Australia. I would not dwell on Bill's work in relation to any of these involvements. They are all well known, a matter of public record and a matter of exceptional pride for those working with him. Rather, I'd like to focus on the role we shared as two members of the Australian delegation to the 2001 UN General Assembly Special Session on AIDS. The leading co-chair of the conference was Australian Ambassador Penny Walmsley, and she delegated to Bill the enormous task of liaising with the entire international community of NGOs to gain support for Australia's drafted final declaration. I watched with awe, amazement, pride and envy as Bill drew together supporters from some 150 delegations, some friendly and helpful, some initially hostile and obstructive, but all approached by Bill with the grace and knowledge, the patience and openness that ensured a unanimity of outcome. There is nothing on the formal UN record that marks Bill's achievement, but thanks to Bill, the declaration is shot through with those green shoots of hope and many positive commitments that marked every stage of the life of Bill Whittaker, a truly great Australian and my friend. And finally, Eamon Murphy and Bill Whittaker worked together on several UN high-level meetings that Australia chaired. Eamon can provide us with an insight into Bill's work abroad and its global impact. Of course, Eamon's unable to be here today in person, but he sent a video pre-recording, which we will now show.
Good afternoon. Eamon Murphy. Sorry, personally, that I'm not there with you to honour Bill and as a person and as a champion of the AIDS response in Australia and globally. I'm not talking just as a representative for UNAIDS, but also as a friend of Bill's, friendship that's grown over more than 25 years since I first met him. Bill was already a highly respected activist for HIV in the community in Australia. He had such a formidable reputation. The bureaucrats in Canberra had warned me because they were afraid of him. And it was often that I realised because he had a stronger command of their briefs than they did, because often they'd move between parts of the department and not be, at the core of the issues that they were working on. And that's what Bill did. He represented the issues he was working on. And he cut through the fluff. He wasn't just highly intelligent. He was super sharp in that processes. He cut through all that fluff that would go on in meetings and get to the substance and keep people focused on the substance. I really got to know Bill in 2001 when we worked together in New York. I was the lead for Australia's delegation for the first high-level meeting on HIV. I worked closely with Bill and got to know him and see him as one of the most capable and able people that we could draw on for our delegation. One night in the early hours, I was in the toilet. And someone senior from another government delegation, I won't mention the government, they just had an election, so you might work it out, came in to see me and was stumbling for words about the person who was speaking on whatever the current paragraph being negotiated, the different issues that were stuck, and eventually got to the point of saying, the person from your community representative. And I said, yes, Bill. And they said, but there are government people at the table. Why aren't they speaking? And I said, well, Bill actually knows more than most of them and is more incapable. He's a key member of our delegation. And that was it. They walked away. I washed my hands, and I will admit I walked back a bit faster maybe to see what it was he was talking about, what had rattled them. Bill understood the issues because he lived them. At the start of the epidemic, he feared that his community in Sydney would be wiped out. He had a different role. He was not working in health or anything of the sort, and came as a gay man living with HIV. He knew that the fight was not just about treatment access in those early days, but about the prejudice and the inequality. And he stood for that throughout the course of the time I've known him. Bill wasn't only a voice and a conscience for the gay community, all people affected by HIV or people living with HIV. And the greatest evidence, I think, of this is how powerful an advocate he became for prevention. He could have just focused on issues affected around treatment and for people living with HIV, but he focused on prevention also in a strong way. Since the 1980s, he championed multiple progressive policies that have accelerated Australia's response, including harm reduction and, more recently, PrEP. He championed and pressed government to lead by example in Australia and to make good on their global commitments. And I remember that after the 2001 first political declaration, and there was a new one every 5 years, and he was involved in others, that he would use that back at the Australian government, and not many were doing that. So he knew the importance of putting them under pressure and holding them accountable. So it was not just as an Australian advocate either. Bill, to me, championed the rights of all people living with HIV in our region and globally. I saw this in his ability to network politically and influence people in that UNGAS, in the different delegations. And then later, when Australia was chairing in 2011, he was brought in as a senior advisor as part of their delegation to help draft text of the new declaration, to build on the two by then that had preceded it. And this was really important because Bill, again, was not about him. He wasn't there for the accolades or recognition. He was there about the issues and how to network and get the right issues included in the text, and that was a really important part of Bill, and that's why later he was also brought in on UNAIDS high-level commission on HIV prevention. He was also a commissioner for the AIDS and Asia response that was generated, the vision that was then given to the Secretary General of the day, Ban Ki-moon, for the region. And he was brought in because not just representing Australia, he was representing a whole diverse range of people and the issues, but he was across all of those and was really instrumental in making that effective. To me, Bill, one of the remarkable things as I got to know him as on a personal and friendship basis was his modesty. He never told you some of the things he had done. He wasn't looking for recognition or rewards. It was never about him. It was always about the people and the issues. Bill gave a voice to the communities that were not included in processes in the early response and always throughout the course of his engagement. His commitments never waned. From the early days with the Mardi Gras and then ACON and as two-time president of AFAO and obviously a special representative with NAPWA. He never stopped speaking up for other people. Bill was remarkable, a leader with a big heart. I was fortunate to get to know him on a personal level, visiting him at his mother's home and his own home later on the Central Coast. He was a mentor and an advisor to me in the different roles I've had in UNAIDS and in different countries. His legacy will live on in the possibility that he saw that we can end AIDS as a public health threat in our lifetimes, not by focusing purely on the biomedical issues, but those issues of inequality and prejudice. So let us honour his memory by doing what he said from the start of his career and all the way through. Follow the evidence, hold governments accountable, and put people in the centre. Rest in peace, Bill.
So we're heading rapidly to the end, and a drink on the corner. I'm impressed that people haven't popped over to get a drink along the way. So I'd like to thank everyone who's been able to come along, spoken to or sent messages today, remembering the huge contribution Bill's made to our lives. But as someone said a little bit earlier, our progress is not inevitable. I think it was you, Graham. And our progress towards the virtual elimination of HIV by 2030 is not inevitable here in Australia or in our region. We all need to continue to step up and have that argument and to engage governments across the country. Thank you for coming along today to remember Bill and sharing your own stories. A very big thank you to the Health Equity Matters and HACON teams for organising the event. Bill Botel just sent me a little note here saying, today is the 52nd anniversary of the election of Gough Whitlam. So auspicious day perhaps for some. But it also follows World AIDS Day yesterday and the Mardi Gras AGM this Saturday. So what an interesting week we chose. Maybe Bill's still influencing our decision making. But thank you for coming along. Please enjoy a drink. But in good Mardi Gras tradition, at the end of the event, there'll be security coming to throw you out of the party because we need to tidy up and we won't be singing the last dance. Thanks, everybody.